Hello students. Last time we have explained most of the things regarding the chemical nature of the cell, where the cell is composed of different type of biochemicals such as proteins, fats, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, water. So these are the some of the important components of the cell which are useful for the formation of different components of the cell, such as cytoplasm of the cell, nucleus of the cell, plasma membrane or cell membrane of the cell, even uh, different type of cell organelles which are present in the cell cytoplasm, which are also composed of different materials, mainly composed of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, minerals, water. So this is what the various biochemicals present in the cell as structural elements of the different components of the cell, that is plasma membrane, cytoplasm, nucleus or nuclear material or the cytoplasmic contents, together with different type of cell organelles which are useful for the performance of the cell or the normal functioning of the cell or whatever the biological functions or the life activities performed by the living organism that are only due to the cells. So these all chemicals are useful for the proper functioning of the cells and which represents the chemical nature of the cell. So this includes mainly the proteins, fats, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, water, even the nucleic acids such as DNA, RNAs, different minerals and the water. So these are the some of the important biochemicals found in the cells, which already we have explained in detail in last lecture. Last time we have also explained the different chemical compounds which are present in the cells, either atom or the molecules or the organic and inorganic molecules or the materials like water, that is inorganic compound, or organic compounds such as proteins, fats, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, etc. Then we have explained the chemical composition of the cell, as cell contains about uh, 70% of the water and the rest of the 30% biochemicals or the chemical compounds in the form of proteins, fats, carbohydrates or the nucleic acids. Then inorganic molecule, that is water. Last time we have explained the detailed structure of the water together with its properties, or how the water molecule is essential uh, for the life. So these are the different points last time we have covered. Uh, uh, then we have also explained the ability of the water to form hydrogen bonds between its molecules, which is responsible for the unique properties of the water, where we have explained different properties of the water which will become useful for the functioning of the cells or different activities of the cells. Then last time we also have explained the importance of the chemical compounds in the cell, such as lipids, proteins, nucleic acids or water, together with their importance or the uses in the cell. Then today we are going to explain the biomacromolecules. Bio means living, macro means large, and molecules means the two or more atoms bound together to form a molecule. So biomacromolecules means the large organic molecules found in the living organisms or made by living organisms, molecules like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, etc. So these are the different type of biomacromolecules or the large sized molecules which are present in the living organisms or which are produced in the living organisms. So bio means living, macro means large, and molecules means the joining or combination of two or more atoms together. So two or more atoms bound together to form a molecules of the different atoms or different chemicals, biochemicals. So biomacromolecules means the large organic molecules found in living organism or present in living organism or produced in living organisms. So these biomacromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, etc. So the first we'll explain about the carbohydrates as biomacromolecules. Carbohydrates as biomacromolecules. So carbohydrates are organic molecules. These are organic molecules composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, CHOs. So these are the organic molecules. Carbohydrates are organic molecules composed of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen. The basic unit of carbohydrates is a sugar molecule called as monosaccharide. So the basic unit or the monomer of the carbohydrates is a sugar, and this sugar molecule is called as monosaccharide. For example, glucose, fructose, galactose, these are the sugar molecules and which are the basic units of the carbohydrates. So carbohydrates forming the chain of monosaccharides may be two sugar molecules or three or more than three sugar molecules in the form of monosaccharides which are joined together, bound together to form a chain of monosaccharides to form either disaccharides or the polysaccharides. So carbohydrates are organic molecules and which are mainly composed of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, and the basic units of the carbohydrates are sugars or also called as the monosaccharides. When two monosaccharides join together, when two monosaccharides join together, a water molecule is released in the hydrolysis reaction and a disaccharide is formed. So at the time of formation of disaccharide, there is a release of one water molecule. So when two monosaccharides join together and form a disaccharide, at that time the water molecule is released. One water molecule is released and the disaccharide is formed. Carbohydrates containing one or two sugar units are called as simple carbohydrates. The carbohydrates which are having single unit or single sugar unit or two sugar units are called as simple carbohydrates, that is monosaccharides or disaccharides. Those containing many molecules are called as complex carbohydrates. Those containing many molecules of the sugar are called as complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides or the mucopolysaccharides. Here we have examples of the monosaccharides and disaccharides. So monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, galactose. Glucose, fructose, galactose. These are the single units or the basic units of the carbohydrates called as monosaccharides, and the examples are glucose, fructose or galactose. These are the monosaccharides. Then disaccharides which are having two sugar molecules or two monosaccharides. The combination of two monosaccharides when two monosaccharides join together and forms a disaccharide. For example, sucrose, which is formed by joining or combination of glucose and fructose. So two monosaccharides, that is glucose and fructose, join together, bound together and forming a sucrose. Then glucose and galactose forms lactose, and two glucose molecules join to form a maltose. So these are the three examples of the disaccharides where each disaccharide, that is sucrose, lactose or maltose, are formed by binding of or joining of two monosaccharide molecules such as glucose, fructose or galactose. In a lower figures, we can see the monosaccharides, the structural formula of the monosaccharides such as glucose and galactose, and the structural formula of sucrose as a disaccharide. So these are the structural formulae of the monosaccharides and disaccharides such as glucose, galactose and sucrose. Then complex carbohydrates are called as polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are the polymers. Polysaccharides are the polymers of the monosaccharides or a chain of monosaccharides and disaccharides. The main polysaccharides are starch, glycogen, cellulose. So the starch, then glycogen and the cellulose, these are the polysaccharides or the complex carbohydrates resulting from the chain of monosaccharides. The binding or joining of a chain of or large number of monosaccharides or the monomers in the form of monosaccharides or disaccharides will result into the formation of complex carbohydrates such as polysaccharides. So these are the examples of the complex carbohydrates or the polysaccharides such as starch, cellulose and the glycogen. Each of these compounds are made of sugar units bonded together but have different properties due to the different ways the sugar molecules are bonded together. So bonding pattern of the sugar units or the monosaccharides is different in a different type of complex carbohydrates or the polysaccharides such as starch, glycogen and cellulose. So starch, glycogen and cellulose, these are the complex carbohydrates or the polysaccharides formed by the polymerization or bonding of the large number of monosaccharides and thus forming a complex carbohydrates with a polymer or a chain of the monosaccharides. And their examples are starch, glycogen and the cellulose, and each of these compounds are made of sugar units or the monosaccharides bonded together but are having a different properties, and this is due to the different ways or the different bonding patterns of the sugar molecules in the complex carbohydrates such as starch, glycogen or cellulose. So starch is a long polymer of the glucose molecules. So starch is composed of a subunits. Starch is composed of its subunits in the form of monosaccharide, that is a glucose. So large number of glucose molecules or the hundreds of glucose molecules are bonded together to form a starch. So starch is a long polymer of the glucose molecules and consisting of hundreds of glucose molecules where all the glucose molecules are oriented in the same direction, where all the glucose molecules are oriented in the same direction. Starch is produced by plants and is used to store energy in its numerous carbon and hydrogen bonds. So starch, we know the starch is a complex carbohydrate or a polysaccharide composed of hundreds of glucose molecules in its chain or in its linear chain. So starch is composed of a glucose molecules or a chain of glucose molecules and which are oriented in the same direction. Starch is found among the plants. Starch is produced by the plants. For example, in potato, sweet potato, we know the examples of the starch, that is a carbohydrate, complex carbohydrate found in the plants like potato or sweet potato. Uh, so starch is produced by the plants. So it is a product of the plants. Starch is a product of the plants and is used to store energy. So whatever the energy stored in the starch in the form of carbon hydrogen bonds of the glucose molecules. So glucose molecule is composed of carbon, hydrogen and oxygen, CHO, and resulting monosaccharide, that is the glucose, which will form a chain of glucose molecules together to form a starch in the plants. So starch is produced by the plants and is used to store the energy in the form of numerous or number of carbon hydrogen bonds present in them in the form of a polymer of glucose molecules or the chain of glucose molecules in the starch. Starch is one of the primary source of energy for the humans as it can be broken down by the amylase enzyme into the individual glucose units. So is digested, starch is digested in presence of enzyme amylase. So when the human being consume the starch, it will be digested under the influence or in presence of enzyme amylase. So amylase enzyme acts upon the starch molecule and split the complex starch molecule into the glucose molecules or the basic units or the individual glucose units or the monosaccharides, which will then be broken down and during its splitting or degradation or disintegration of the glucose molecule into carbon, hydrogen or oxygen, resulting into the release of energy. So energy is released on breaking of the bonds. Energy is released on breaking of the bonds of the glucose molecules or when it passes through the energy cycle. When it passes through the energy cycle, during each time the energy is released on breaking of the bonds. So starch is one of the primary source of energy for the human being and it can be broken down into the glucose units or the glucose molecules in presence of amylase enzyme. Starch is insoluble in water. Starch is insoluble in water. There are three types of starch such as amylose, inulin and amylopectin. There are three types of starch molecules or starch is of three types. Starch is insoluble in water and there are three types of starch such as amylose, inulin and amylopectin. In figure we can see there are two types of starch such as amylose and amylopectin are given in the figure. So in figure we can see the amylose. Amylose is a starch, a type of starch containing a linear chain of the glucose molecules. And amylopectin is a starch consisting of branches, having branches which are again formed due to the branching chains of the starch molecule. So starch molecule consisting of linear chains together with the branches which are again consisting of the glucose molecules. So there are different type of starch such as amylose, inulin or amylopectin and having different pattern of its bonding or the combination of the sugar units or the glucose molecules. So starch is a complex carbohydrate and is produced in the plants, which also serves as a energy source, which also provides energy to the human being, and the energy is stored in the starch molecule in the form of numerous carbon hydrogen bonds. So it's about the starch. So starch is a long polymer of the glucose molecules consisting of hundreds of glucose molecules and which is a primary source of energy for the human being and is produced in the plants such as potato or sweet potato, which are consisting of starch as a complex carbohydrate. Then glycogen. So source of the glycogen is animals. So animals store excess glucose molecules. Animals store excess glucose molecules or excess glucose by polymerization or by polymerizing it to form a glycogen. So glycogen is also composed of a chain or a polymer of hundreds of glucose molecules. So animals transform the glucose molecules into a complex carbohydrate or the polysaccharide, that is the glycogen. So animals store excess of glucose by polymerizing the glucose or the monosaccharides into a glycogen. So glycogen is formed by just bonding or joining of large number of glucose molecules to form a chain of glucose molecules either in the form of chain or linear chain or the branched or forked chains of the glucose molecules to form a complex molecule of the glycogen. Excess glucose is converted to glycogen in the liver for the storage. So the site of the glycogen synthesis or the storage of the glycogen synthesis in the animal is liver. So excess of the glucose from the blood is converted to the glycogen in the liver and where it is stored as a energy source, as a energy store or energy source in the liver. The liver can store up to 100 grams of the glycogen. The liver can store up to 100 gram of glycogen in the hepatic tissues or the liver tissues. Then muscle tissues can store approximately 300 grams of the glycogen. So this is the capacity of the structural elements or the components of the living organism where the glycogen can be stored. So glycogen is a reserve food material. Glycogen is the reserve food material and can be stored as a glycogen as a reserve food material or the reserve of the carbohydrate in the liver or in the muscles. So capacity of the liver where about 100 gram of the glycogen can be stored in the liver or about 300 grams of the glycogen can be stored in the muscle tissues. Once the storage capacity of the liver and muscle is reached, excess glucose is converted to the fat. So, in the body of the living organism, there is a sort of mechanism or a sort of metabolism, sort of mechanism where the excess of the glucose is transformed into the fats and then which can be stored in the body or in the tissues or in the cells in the form of the fat globules or the fat droplets or the vacuoles containing the complex fats. So the excess of the glucose after uh, the after the capacity of the storage, after finishing the capacity of the storage of the sugars or the glucose in the liver or in the muscles, the excess of the glucose is transformed into the fats. Glucose uh, glucose is a monosaccharide and it is a primary source of energy. So whenever the body needs energy and if there is uh, a shortage or there is a scarcity of the glucose or glycogen in the body, ultimately the fats are again transformed into the glucose molecules. Fats are again transformed back into the glucose molecules so as to provide or so as to produce the energy, so as to supply the energy. So the actually there is a integration of metabolism. Actually, in the body of living organism, there is a provision or there is a mechanism called as integration of metabolism where the proteins, fats and the carbohydrates, where proteins, fats and the carbohydrates, proteins, simplest forms of the proteins, that is amino acids, simplest forms of the lipids, that is fatty acids and the glycerol, and the simplest form of the carbohydrate, that is glucose or the monosaccharides, are the uh, simplest forms of the proteins, fats and carbohydrates, and that are interconvertible. That are interconvertible. Not only the lipids or the fats are transformed into glucose or glucose are transformed into the fats, but the proteins, fats and carbohydrates which are interconvertible. So any of the food stuff or the simplest form of the food stuff, that is proteins, fat or carbohydrates, that are interconvertible. So whatever the material lacking in the body, that is produced bodily through the mechanism of integration of metabolism. So once the storage capacity of the liver and muscle is reached, excess of glucose is converted to fats. Glycogen is different starch in that the glucose chain is branched or forked. So already we have explained the structure of starch. So starch is composed of a linear chain of the glucose molecule or a straight chain of the glucose molecule. Starch is a linear or the straight chain or a polymer of the glucose molecules. Glycogen is having a complex chains or the branched uh, chains or the polymers of the glucose molecules. Glycogen is different starch. Glycogen is different starch. That is, starch is having a straight chain of the polymers or hundreds of glucose molecules to form a starch. But in glycogen, there are branched chains. There is a branching, rebranching of the glucose molecule to form a chains. So complex chains or the branched or forked chains of the glucose molecules will result into the formation of glycogen. So glycogen is different starch in that the glucose chain is branched, means there are number of chains of the glucose molecules which are bound together to form a complex molecule of the glycogen having glucose chains representing the branched structure or the forked structure. Then third, cellulose. Already we have explained about the starch, glycogen, and third one, that is the cellulose as a complex carbohydrate or the polysaccharide. Cellulose is probably the single most abundant organic material or the substance in the biosphere. Cellulose is probably a single or only one most abundant organic material or the biochemical present in the biosphere. It is the major structural material or the component of which the plants are made. So plants are composed of a cellulose. So cellulose is probably a single or cellulose is a single most abundant organic chemical or a substance present in the biosphere and which is composed or which is composed of again monosaccharides or the sugar units but is produced in the plants. Cellulose is the important structural material or the component of the plants. So plant cell wall is composed of cell. Plant cell wall is composed of cellulose. It is a complex carbohydrate. Cellulose is a long polymer of the glucose molecules. Similar to starch and glycogen, cellulose is also a polymer of glucose molecules consisting of hundreds of glucose molecules, hundreds of glucose molecules in the form of a polymer or a chain of monomers in the form of glucose. So, cellulose is also a polymer of glucose molecules and consisting of chain of glucose molecules with a hundreds of its number. So cellulose is a long polymer of glucose molecules and consisting of hundreds of glucose molecules in the form of chain of the cellulose in the form of chain of glucose molecules to form a cellulose. However, the orientation of the molecules, that is glucose molecules, is a little different in that every other molecule is upside down. Every molecule of the cellulose is upside down. So while uh, formation or the orientation of the chain of the glucose molecules in a cellulose, chain of the glucose molecules in the chain of glucose molecules in the cellulose will have a, a, a typical pattern of its polymerization or its bonding. So the orientation of the molecules of the glucose, orientation of the molecules of the glucose is somewhat different. It's somewhat different and is representing a, a molecule that is upside down. There are no side chains in the cellulose. There are no side chains in the cellulose as are found in the glycogen. So in the glycogen, there are side chains or the branched chains of the glucose molecules to form a complex molecule of the glycogen. So glucose molecule is having branched chains of the glucose molecules in the glycogen. But in the cellulose, there are linear chains, straight chains of the glucose molecules to form a cellulose. So there are no side chains in the cellulose like in a starch which allows the linear cellulose molecules to lie close together. So there is a orientation of the glucose molecules in the form of linear chains similar to starch. In starch also, there are linear chains of the glucose molecules. In starch also, there are linear chains or the polymers or hundreds of glucose molecules bound together or bonded together to form a linear chain or the straight chain of the starch molecule. In case of glycogen, there are branched chains of the glucose molecules and thus forming a branched structure or the fork structure of the chains of the glucose molecules which are present in the glycogen. In cellulose also, similar to starch, there are linear chains of the glucose molecules or straight chains of the glucose molecules. So there are no side chains or the branching present in the cellulose. Like starch, cellulose is also having a linear chain of the glucose molecules which allow the linear cellulose molecules to lie close together. Due to different arrangement of the glucose molecules, there are many opportunities for hydrogen bonds between the adjacent chains, which creates a strong stiff material. So, due to the glucose molecules, due to the orientation or a different arrangement, due to a typical pattern or a typical type of orientation of the glucose molecules, due to a typical type of orientation of the glucose molecules in the cellulose molecule or in the chains of the cellulose, the hydrogen bonds between the adjacent chains creates a strong or stiff material or a fiber, cellulose fiber. So, number of cellulose chains which lying or which lies one upon another, and there is a formation of a hydrogen bonding between the two chains of the cellulose molecules. So, due to different arrangements of the glucose molecules in the linear chains of the cellulose, this will provide an opportunity to the hydrogens to bond between the two chains. So, two chains of the cellulose can bound together to form a strong stiff material or a cellulose fiber as shown in the figure. We can see the cellulose chains. So, there are several cellulose chains which are having hydrogen bonding between the adjacent chains. So, due to a particular pattern of the glucose molecules, that is upside down. It is a type of pattern of glucose molecules bonding in the linear chain of the cellulose molecule, and this will lead to the formation of the fibers due to the uh, bonding due to the bonding of the hydrogens between the adjacent cellulose chains. There is a formation of stiff fiber or a strong stiff material in the form of cellulose fibers, and that are formed in the plants. So, the cellulose forms the structural material, or cellulose forms a structural material or the component of the plants. So, the plant cell wall, we know the plant cell wall consisting of cellulose. Plant cell wall is made up of cellulose, which is the complex polysaccharide or the carbohydrate. So, in figure we can see there are several cellulose chains which are bonded together to form a, a strong stiff material or a fiber composed of cellulose chains or the cellulose molecules, and this happens due to the bonding of the hydrogen atoms between the adjacent cellulose chains which are bound together by means of hydrogen bonding between the adjacent chains of the cellulose molecules, and this will form the structural component or the fibers in the plants. Then lipids, that is fats and oils. Lipids. So now we have explained about the different type of carbohydrates, that is monosaccharide, disaccharides or the polysaccharides, and even the complex type of carbohydrates or their examples such as starch, glycogen or cellulose, which are found either in plants and animals as an important organic material or the energy rich materials or the biomolecules or the biomacromolecules in the form of carbohydrates. Then second type of biomacromolecules which are also found in the cells or in the living organism, that is plants and animals, that is lipids. So structure of fats or the lipids or the oils. So in figure we can see the bottles containing different type of oils as a chemical component of the plants or the animals, that is in the form of lipids or the fats and oils. So in slide we can see the structure of triglyceride, containing a glycerol with three chains of the fatty acids. So one glycerol molecule with three fatty acid chains together will form a structure of triglyceride. So glycerol with three chains of the fatty acids and forming a structure of triglyceride. Then in a uh, lower part we can see the phospholipids, which are the important component of the plasma membrane, possessing a, a spherical structure called as hydrophilic head, and the hydrophobic tails. So hydrophobic tails are composed mainly of fatty acids. Hydrophobic tails are due to presence of fatty acids in the hydrophobic tails of the uh, phospholipid molecule, which will form a uh, lipid bilayer in the plasma membrane. So the component of the plasma membrane, the lipid component of the plasma membrane, that is consisting of lipid bilayers, and each of the layer of the lipid consisting of a layer of uh, phospholipid mainly composed of the glycerol or glycerol molecule or the head with composed of glycerol together with a phosphate and the chain of fatty acids. So lipid bilayer is composed of the hydrophilic and hydrophobic component of the phospholipids, possessing the hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails. So this is what the structure present in the plasma membrane, composed of lipids and mainly composed of phospholipids. So phospholipid consisting of hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tails. Hydrophilic head is composed of glycerol together with the phosphate or the phosphorus or the phosphate group in the glycerol, that will form a hydrophilic head and a chain of fatty acids in association with the hydrophilic head, that is a hydrophobic tail. So hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid are composed of the fatty acids. So these are the diagrams showing the molecules of the triglyceride, triglyceride. So saturated triglyceride, uh, which is composed of a glycerol molecule with three fatty acids. Then in figure we can see a separate molecule or the structural formula of the glycerol and triglyceride also. So in figure we can see the lipids in the form of fats and oils, and which are composed of, or lipids or fatty acids. Lipids or the fatty acids. Lipids are the complex lipids. Lipids are the complex molecules of the uh, Lipids are the complex molecules composed of fatty acids and the glycerol. Fatty acids and the glycerol together will form a lipid. So, lipid is a complex form and fatty acids and glycerol are the simplest forms of the lipids. And these uh, lipids are composed or present in the fats and the oils. So, fats and oils which are composed of or consisting of the lipids in the form of a complex component in the cells or in the living organisms. So, functions of the lipids in the body. There are four different functions of the lipids in our body or in the animals. There are four different functions performed by the lipids in the human being or in the body of the animals. The first one, that is energy storage. So lipids contain a lot of energy, that is kilojoule, kJ, small kJ in bracket, that is kilojoule. So large quantity of the energy is stored in the lipids, energy storage. So this is the important function of the lipids in the body, that is the storage of the energy. So highest amount of energy sorry, highest amount of energy is stored in the lipids, then proteins, and then carbohydrates. So the lowest or the less quantity of energy is stored, lowest quantity of energy is stored in the carbohydrates. The medium or the moderate amount of energy is stored in the proteins, and highest amount of the energy is stored in the lipids. So lipids are the food components or the biochemicals present in the animals or in the cells containing a large quantity of energy or a lot of energy in a small space, so even a smaller molecular weight or the smaller molecular weight or in the small molecules of the lipid, there is a large quantity of energy is stored. So lipids are the energy components or the energy rich components. The lipids are the energy components and which stores large quantity of the energy or a lot of energy in a small space. Since lipids are generally insoluble in polar substances such as water, they are stored in a special vacuoles in the fat cells. So usually the lipids are stored in the body in the fat cells, either in the form of vacuoles or the droplets, fat droplets or the fatty vacuoles. So vacuoles containing the fats in the fat cells or the in adipose tissues. So adipose tissues consisting of fat cells, and fat cells mainly contain the vacuoles containing reserve food material in the form of lipids. So lipids contain a lot of energy in a small space. Since lipids are generally insoluble in water, since lipids are generally insoluble in a polar substances or is solvents like water, and they are stored in a special vacuoles in the fat cells. So lipids are stored in the vacuoles or in the form of globules or the droplets, in the form of lipid droplets in the vacuoles, and which are mainly present in the fat cells or the fatty tissues like adipose tissues. Then another function of the lipid, that is insulation. The first and main function of the lipids in the body, that is energy storage. So large quantity of energy is stored in the form of lipids in the cells and particularly in the fat cells. Then second function of the lipids in the body, that is insulation. Fat stores give a good insulation against the cold. So fats represents the insulating layer or insulating substance in the body and which protects the body from the cold and thus provides the insulation, and providing the insulating layer or insulation to the body and protecting the body from the cold during winters. Then in the membranes. So lipids form the important component of the membranes, simply the membranes which are present around the cell or inside the cell. So membranes which are mainly composed of phospholipids, and phospholipids are thus forming the structural components of the cell membranes or the plasma membranes or the membranes found within the cell or around the cell. So whatever the cell membranes or the plasma membranes or the membranes which are forming the covering membranes of the cells or the cell organelles, which are mainly composed of phospholipids, and these phospholipids mainly forms the structural component of the cellular membranes, may present inside of the cell or the around the cells, and protecting the cellular components or the various substances whatever present in the cytoplasm or the nucleoplasm that are protected in the membranes, which are mainly derived from the phospholipids. So lipids or the phospholipids forming the structural components of the membranes present inside of the cell or around the cell. Hormones. Most of the hormones which are steroids, and these steroids are the primary structures or the components of the hormones. So hormones and steroids are the lipids. Hormones and the steroids, whatever are present in the cells, that are composed of lipids. So steroids and hormones. Steroids or the steroid hormones. There are some hormones like insulin which are protein in nature, but majority of the hormones are steroid steroids, and steroids are composed of lipids. So almost all hormones or majority of the hormones which are composed of steroids, and steroids are lipids. So hormones, that is steroids which are the primary structure, steroids which are the primary structures or the components of the hormones. So hormones and steroids both are lipid in its chemical composition. So the chemistry or the chemical nature of the steroids and hormones are lipids. So the lipids are performing the major function of the storage of energy in the form of fats, storage of the energy in the form of fats in the cells or the cellular components. Then it provides the function of insulation. It also forms the main structural component of the cellular membranes or even the membranes of the cell organelles that are also derived from the phospholipids. So membranes, insulation, energy storage, then hormones, which are mainly composed of lipids. So these are the some of the functions of the lipids. Then chemical structure of the lipids. Lipids are made from two types of molecules such as glycerol and the fatty acids. Already we have explained in the structure of phospholipid, that is a lipid bilayer of the plasma membrane, which is consisting of headed pin-like structures. Headed pin-like structures. So head, that is a round structure of the glycerol, and the which is accompanied with the fatty acid chains. So glycerol and the fatty acids, glycerol and the fatty acids will form the structure of lipids. So simplest forms of the lipids, just like the glucose in the carbohydrate or the amino acids in the proteins. The glycerol and the fatty acids are the simplest forms of the lipids. So lipids are mainly composed of two type of molecules, that is glycerol and the fatty acids. Triglycerides have three fatty acids. Triglycerides, means the triglycerides which are having three fatty acids. Triglycerides which have three fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. So the triglyceride, structure of triglyceride will have one glycerol molecule, and to which there are three fatty acids. To the glycerol molecule, there are three fatty acids which are attached. There are three fatty acids. There are three fatty acids which are attached to the one glycerol molecule to form a triglyceride. If there is a diglyceride, then the one glycerol with two chains of the fatty acids, then will form a diglyceride. So glycerol molecule with two fatty acids or the two chains of the fatty acids, one glycerol molecule with two chains of the fatty acids will form a diglyceride. One glycerol molecule with three chains of the fatty acids will form a triglyceride. So in figure we can see one glycerol and three chains of the fatty acids which are bound together to form a triglyceride. So triglyceride is a lipid. Triglyceride is a lipid consisting of one glycerol molecule and three fatty acid chains. So the tail of fatty acid, the tail of fatty acid is a long hydrocarbon chain. The tail of fatty acids, which is hydrophobic, the tail of fatty acid, which is a long chain of the hydrocarbons, which is non-polar, and therefore hydrophobic. Glycerol molecule, glycerol molecule, the glycerol molecule in the triglyceride is a polar, and thus it is hydrophilic. So glycerol molecule or the glycerol is a polar molecule. Glycerol is a polar molecule, and thus it is a hydrophilic. The fatty acids which are non-polar, the fatty acids which are non-polar and thus are hydrophobic. So the tail of fatty acid is a long hydrocarbon chain. The tail of fatty acid is a long hydrocarbon chain which is non-polar and therefore hydrophobic. This means that it is not attracted to the water. This means it is not attracted to water. When attached to a glycerol molecule, the resulting fat is also hydrophobic, so that fats and oils are insoluble in water. Even the fatty acids or the hydrocarbon chains of the hydrocarbon which are found in the fatty acids, which are non-polar molecules, and thus the fats are hydrophobic. Even the fatty acids or non-polar molecules of the fatty acids, even though attached with the glycerol molecule, cannot dissolved in the water, cannot be dissolved in the water due to presence of hydrophobic tails. Glycerol heads or the glycerol molecule is a polar one or is hydrophilic. The glycerol molecule is polar. Glycerol is polar and is hydrophilic, but due to its attachment with the fatty acids which are hydrophobic or non-polar, ultimately whatever the fats or the lipids that will become insoluble in water. So the resulting fats are hydrophobic, so that fats and oils are insoluble in water. So fats are insoluble. Fats are insoluble in water due to presence of hydrophobic tails or hydrophobic chains of the fatty acids as a non-polar component of the fats or the lipids. So this is about the lipids, chemical structure of the lipid. Lipids are composed of glycerol and fatty acids. Glycerol are hydrophilic molecules or component of the lipids, and fatty acids are hydrophobic component of the lipids or non-polar components of the lipids. Fatty acids are non-polar, glycerol are polar. Glycerol are hydrophilic and fatty acids are hydrophobic, and there is a bonding of glycerol hydrophilic with a non-polar fatty acids, that is hydrophobic fatty acids, and thus whatever the molecule of the fat formed by the glycerol and the fatty acids will become water insoluble due to the hydrophobic tails or the hydrophobic chains of the fatty acids in the lipids. So whatever the lipid molecules or the fats present in the cell or in the body that are water insoluble. So that cannot be dissolved in the water. Fats or the lipids cannot be dissolved in the water due to hydrophobic fatty acids or the chains of fatty acids in the complex molecules of the lipids. Saturated, monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. So these terms refers to the number of hydrogen atoms attached to the hydrogen carbon tails of the fatty acids. Saturated or monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. So these terms saturated, unsaturated or saturated, monounsaturated or polyunsaturated terms to the lipids refer to the number of hydrogen atoms attached to the hydrocarbon tails of the fatty acids. So fatty acids consisting of hydrocarbons, chain of the hydrocarbons, or the components of the fatty acids containing hydrogen and carbon and which are having a definite number of hydrogen atoms. So on the basis of presence of number of hydrogen atoms, the term refers to the saturated or monounsaturated or polyunsaturated to the lipids. So saturated means they have many hydrogen atoms. So when the lipids consisting of many hydrogen atoms bonded to their carbons as possible. Saturated fats are generally solid at room temperature. Saturated fats are generally solid solid state in a at a room temperature. Saturated means the lipids which are having large number or many number of hydrogen atoms bonded to their carbons. So whatever the lipids or the fats having a chain of fatty acids or the chain of fatty acids and glycerol containing carbon atoms or the carbons and which are having if a large number of hydrogen atom then are called as saturated lipids. Saturated lipids. So saturated means they have large number of hydrogen atoms bonded with the carbons. So saturated fats are generally solid at room temperature. Unsaturated means unsaturated lipids or the fats have one or more double bonds connecting their carbon atoms and hence have fewer or less number of hydrogen atoms. So due to the more one or more due to presence of one or more double bonds due to presence of one or more double bonds connecting the carbon atoms in the lipids or in the fats due to double bonds, one or more number of double bonds between the carbon atoms, there is a less number of hydrogen atoms. There is a less number of hydrogen atoms, and thus the fats or lipids becomes unsaturated. So unsaturated fats are generally liquid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats are generally liquid at room temperature. So in figure we can see the structure of saturated and monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fatty acids or the lipids. So butyric acid with a 4 carbon atom and the hydrogen atoms. Butyric acid is a saturated fatty acid. Butyric acid is a saturated fatty acids with a many number of hydrogen atoms bonded with the carbon or the carbon chain of the fatty acid. That is the butyric acid. Butyric acid is a saturated fatty acid because of presence of more number of hydrogen atom bonded with the carbon atoms. Then oleic acid called as monounsaturated fatty acids. Oleic acid is the example of monounsaturated fatty acid because of presence of one double bond, one double bond, one double bond. The oleic acid is having one double bond in its chemical structure, that is monounsaturated fatty acid. Then linoleic acid is called as polyunsaturated fatty acid. Linoleic acid is called as polyunsaturated fatty acid due to presence of two double bonds. Due to means due to presence of one double bond or two double bond or more number of double bonds in the fatty acids or in the fats becomes unsaturated, and unsaturated fats are generally liquids at a room temperature. Unsaturated fats occur in a liquid state at a room temperature, and the saturated fatty acids are solid at a room temperature. Saturated fatty acids will have large number of hydrogen atoms bonded with the carbon atom. Saturated lipids or the fatty acids are having large number of or many number of hydrogen atoms bonded with the carbon atoms, and saturated fats or the saturated fatty acids are occurring in a solid state at a room temperature, and unsaturated fats or the fatty acids will have more number of double bonds, one or more number of double bonds, one number or two or more number of double bonds, and ultimately reducing or decreasing the number of hydrogen atoms, and unsaturated fats are occurring in a liquid state at a room temperature, and the example of which are oleic acid as a monounsaturated fatty acid and linoleic acid as a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Oleic acid and linoleic acid are the examples of monounsaturated fatty acid and polyunsaturated fatty acids respectively, and butyric acid is a saturated fatty acid. Butyric acid is a saturated fatty acid because of presence of single bonding between the carbon atom and possessing a more number of hydrogen atoms. But in case of unsaturated fatty acids, that is oleic acid and linoleic acid, there are two carbon bonds or one carbon bond between the carbon atoms. That is double bonding between the carbon atoms. One double bond between the carbon atom or two double bonds between the carbon atoms representing monounsaturated fatty acid and polyunsaturated fatty acids, and their examples are oleic acid and linoleic acid, while butyric acid is a saturated fatty acid. So this is what about saturated, monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fatty acids or the lipids. So today we will stop here, and next time we will explain about the next part or the remaining part of the topic, that is um, biomacromolecules, 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 that is either carbohydrates, proteins, fats, or the nucleic acids which are present in the living organisms or which are present in the cells. So, uh, with this, today we will stop here, and next time we will continue the same topic, that is biomacromolecules present in the cell or in the living organism. Thank you.